Good afternoon to our participants. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you to this panel discussion on repositioning state-owned enterprises and development finance institutions. This project began back in 2020 in the middle of the first wave of COVID-19, and it was supported by Telkom. Telkom and the Wits School of Governance got together and looked at various dimensions of the country's economic status, and we decided to work together in developing insights towards the economic recovery program. One of the papers that we identified was that on state-owned enterprises. Instead of just looking at state-owned enterprises, we thought it would also make sense to look at development finance institutions, because they fall under the same family and they tend to be neglected. This has since become an important area of work for the Wits School of Governance. We have since been approached by the Minister of Public Enterprises, Minister Pravin Gordhan, for us to provide technical support to the work of the Presidential Commission on State-Owned Enterprises. About an hour ago, we had a very intense, fascinating discussion with the officials at the Department of Trade, Department of Public Enterprises, on the different dimensions for restructuring of state-owned enterprises. So we're very excited to be part of this initiative, and Dr. Garth Lepierre's paper comes at the right time, even though he completed the paper about 6 months or so ago, and we delayed the presentation of the paper. It provides us with a platform to offer insights into these processes we are involved in as a school. So with those words, I would like to really welcome you to this discussion. I certainly am looking forward to it. Some of the team members who are working on the technical side that supports the Presidential Commission are part of this webinar. Dr. Lumkile Mundy is a colleague of mine at the Faculty of Commerce, Law and Management, a scholar who is well known and a public intellectual, will be moderating this session. I wish you all the best in your deliberation. Over to you, Lumkile.
Thank you so much, Professor Kobo, for welcoming our guests. I would like to welcome all of you on Facebook, as well as those that are on Zoom. It is our pleasure as the Wits School of Governance to host you this afternoon. More importantly, those on Facebook, please do write any questions or comments you might have. We'll take them at the end. Similarly, those on Zoom, there is a Q&A facility, please use it, but also there's a chat facility, please use it. We'll pick them up once my speakers have finalized their interventions. Please, just to introduce also that the whole proceeding is being recorded and will be shared on the Wits School of Governance process of this afternoon by introducing my speakers. I have the author of the paper who will be leading the presentation today, Dr. Garth Lepierre, who is the visiting professor in the Political Studies Department at the University of Pretoria, and a senior associate at Mapungubwe Institute of Strategic Reflection. Dr. Garth Lepierre is a founding executive director of the Institute for Global Dialogue, where he served for 12 years. He holds a BA with honors, with highest honors from Rutgers University, New Jersey, USA, and went on to do postgrad studies in political science at Yale University in Connecticut, where he holds an MA, MPhil, and a PhD degrees. His area of interest and publication record includes international political economy, political philosophy, public policy, multilateral trade, and emerging markets, South African foreign policy, and the politics of Africa and the Middle East. Welcome, Dr. Gasly Pierre. I've got two respondents. I've got Dr. Michael Richards, Dr. Michelle Richards, who has a PhD degree in political science and a certificate in human studies from Rutgers University in the US, and an International Executive Development Program certificate from the Gordon Institute for Business Sciences at the University of Pretoria, Gibbs. In 2018, Dr. Michelle Richards completed a master's degree in commerce in development finance at UCT Graduate School of Business. Michelle is a research specialist at the Development Bank Southern Africa, where she works on strategy-focused research, gender mainstreaming, and South-South cooperation. Dr. Michelle Richards is also a faculty member at Gibbs in Johannesburg, where she teaches diversity and inclusion and human leadership courses. She has taught at universities in South Africa, the US, and Japan. Her publications are in the areas of international social reform, militarization in Africa, infrastructure development, gender and development, gender and trade, identity politics, poverty reduction, and regional integration and development. Lastly, my last speaker will be Dr. Mfeka. Dr. Mfeka is the CEO and founder of SE Advisory. He advises foreign and local investor investment facilitation and policy engagements. Dr. Mfeka is a strategist for businesses and governments. He is an international consultant at Global SME Search Project for the United Nations. Dr. Mfeka is a business and development economist and former economic advisor to the presidency of South Africa. He was our representative at the G20, where he co-chaired the development working group at BRICS as well as NEPAD for 5 years. Before joining the presidency, Dr. Mfeka consulted as a project manager for the Presidential Review Committee on State-Owned Enterprises. He was part of the team that successfully piloted the technology transfer model for South Africa through the National Technology Incubation Fund. Dr. Mfeka holds qualification in Development Economics and Industrialization, an MBA in Development Industrialization from Liverpool, and Doctor of Technology from Durban University of Technology. Those are my three speakers, but let me now hand over to Garth, the author of the paper, who's going to lead us this afternoon. Garth, I hand over to you. Welcome.
Dr. Mundy, thank you very much. And my thanks to Dr. Reuters and Mfeka for being the discussants, but also let me quickly add my thanks to Professor Kobo and Dr. Ngwenya. I don't know if she's part of this platform, for inviting me to be part of this project. So my appreciation to them. Now, in terms of the focus of this paper, the operative term here is repositioning, and I want to underscore that. Repositioning state-owned enterprises and development finance institutions. The paper goes about this by trying to explore three cross-cutting themes. The first is the nature and purpose of SOEs and DFIs in South Africa's political economy. The second is really trying to examine their performances with reference to their effectiveness, the ability to deliver on the developmental mandates. And then thirdly, and quite crucially, how a triangular engagement between SOEs, DFIs, and the private sector in South Africa could address South Africa's low growth trajectory and the prospects of economic recovery. Mindful, of course, that the country faces a critical social and economic inflection point, pushing crisis proportions. and that require very urgent redress, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And most crucially, I would argue, in terms of the recent upheavals, unrest that we have witnessed across KZN and parts of Gauteng, which are emblematic and symptomatic, I would argue, of the deep tap root of racialized poverty, inequality, and unemployment in this country. So what I will try to do, Dr. Mundy, in the 1 hour you have allocated to me, the 20 minutes you've allocated to me, is and hit sort of the contours of 4 bases of the paper. The first is an overview of SOEs and DFIs, highlighting their relevant characteristics, as these are informed essentially by 2 very important official assessments and evaluations, which I'll refer to presently. The second is the comparative country experiences and international best practice metrics. Now, I won't go into great detail on those. I believe that the paper will be made available to participants, but I want to sort of stress the experience of China in that regard, because I think it's both suggestive and instructive for South Africa. And then the third is to look at the dynamics of this triangular relationship between SOEs, DFIs, and the private sector, in terms of the very important principles of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Those principles are extremely interesting and useful for how you shape an ecosystem of that triangular relationship. Then I want to try and suggest 2 clusters, as it were, of policy recommendations, and I'll quickly make a concluding remark to finish off. So, how do we assess the state of SOEs and DFIs in South Africa? So, first point to make is, if you compare the status and purpose of state-owned enterprises and development finance institutions in South Africa, what is quite remarkable is the extent to which SOEs have been the subject of real careful examination, very detailed analysis, as well as sustained scrutiny. And I presume that is because of their strategic importance to the South African government's growth and development agenda, especially, the economic transformation objectives that go with that. Here, let me refer to, 3 very important points of reference that this paper draws on. The first is quite a comprehensive examination that was released in 2013, incidentally established, under the authority of President Zuma, growing the economy, bridging the gap, and the chair of that presidential review committee, hereafter referred as the PRC, was Ria Pieka. And, she went on to become quite a controversial national police commissioner, but I think, this report is really a testament to her leadership in sort of guiding a very complex process and producing a very insightful report. Then in 2019, the paper then also refers to 5 working papers which were done under the auspices of the National Planning Commission in the presidency. Very insightful papers under the general theme of the role of state-owned enterprises in achieving economic transformation and inclusive growth. Now, Professor Kobo, in his introduction, referred to the 2020, June 2020 Presidential State-Owned Enterprises Council that was established by President Ramaphosa, chaired by himself, essentially to help his government, steer an agenda that will shift the focus and emphasis of SOEs in the direction of economic transformation and development. Now, and development, the very interesting common threads that run through the investigations of both the Presidential Review Committee as well as the National Planning Commission papers are firstly how SOEs could better serve the ends of South Africa's mental state ambitions? And then secondly, how well positioned and ready are they to play a prominent, appropriate, and leading role in achieving economic transformation? Having said that, what is really interesting also is that development finance institutions have not been the focus of the same level of scrutiny and examination, especially given their complementary, symbiotic, and mutually supportive roles to SOEs. As a matter of fact, in doing the background research for this paper, I could only find one official inquiry into the roles, functions, and performance of development finance institutions conducted by the National Treasury in 2008. And there are, of course, other academic policy papers that the study drew on. So let me just then summarize very quickly what the Presidential Review Committee has to say. Very crucially, according to the PRC estimate and its database, there are 715 SOEs that exist across all levels of government. Although, the NPC data base claims that this figure is closer to 800. Be that as it may, the PRC was mainly concerned with how such a large portfolio of state-owned enterprises was responding to the government's development agenda. And that includes, by the way, both commercial and non-commercial SOEs, as well as their subsidiaries and Chapter 9 institutions. Now, this is very important because if we take the asset base of all SOEs together in South Africa, it amounts to over R1 trillion. They contribute, that is, SOEs contribute 8.5% of GDP, and they employ more than 250,000 people in a highly unionized environment. So what is the assessment of the Presidential Review Committee of 2013? This can be summarized as follows. 4 points. First is an absence of a universal long-term vision and a clear strategic plan for the roles that SOEs are expected to play. The second is that the legislative framework, governance, ownership policy, and oversight systems for SOEs are grossly inadequate, which points to conflicts of interest and duplication. Third is that SOEs struggle to contribute to meeting the government's developmental agenda because of the massive capital injections they require, and this leads to a very mixed record of service delivery performance. And then fourthly, they suffer from a distinct lack of strong and robust leadership, especially in meeting the development objectives of shareholder compacts. These generic problems and challenges, according to the PRC report, have resulted in socializing the costs through government bailouts and forms of state rescue. And state SOE performance is further hindered by poor technical and management skills, a lack of financing capacity to sustain their operations, poor strategic foresight to plan for the road ahead. And as we have witnessed in the recent evidence that has come before the Zondo Commission, this has been compounded by egregious forms of corruption and the abuse of resources. What does the National Planning Commission assessment say? Let me jump to that very quickly. The interesting thing about these 5 papers is that they concentrate their endeavor and their efforts on 3 strategic areas of state-owned activity. That is Eskom in the provision of electricity, Transnet in the provision of freight logistics, PASA in the provision of commuter and passenger rail services. What is interesting about the NPC assessment and the 5 papers that go with it is the kind of conceptual framework that it offers in the analysis. And here, the framework defines 6 operational themes around which very critical and strategic questions are asked. And let me summarize these very quickly. The first, relating to these three state entities, are their commercial and economic mandate. And the question then which the 5 papers then ask, and which they try to respond to, is, do they provide economic infrastructure and services efficiently, cost-effectively, reliably? That is in terms of the commercial economic mandate. Then secondly is the non-commercial developmental mandate. Do they provide social services to the excluded groups efficiently, cost-effectively, and reliably? And thirdly, in terms of financial viability, do they sustain an asset base and balance sheet in order to make the necessary capital investments and maintain and expand services as a consequence? The fourth is environmental sustainability. Do they support the transition in South Africa for low carbon economy and observe judicious and prudential environmental standards? Fifth is specific projects. Do they undertake specific projects as defined in the National Development Plan? And then finally is the transformation responsibility. Do they promote equitable participation in the economy through employment equity training and supplier development? So what is the net finding of this broad-based analysis in the 5 papers that do with Eskom, Transnet, and PASA? And let me quote directly from the main finding. It says, Eskom, Transnet, and PASA, quote unquote, are not performing well in delivering to the aspirations of the National Development Plan. Although progress has been registered in some areas, such as BE, economic empowerment, this is largely ascribed, this is the performance, that is, of Eskom, Transnet, and PASA, is largely ascribed, the poor performance, that is, sorry, years of uncertain policy expectation, various funding strategies, poor institutional accountability, poor governance, and finally, political interference. So that is sort of a quick overview of the SOEs. What about development finance institutions? What is important to note here, and I'll skip over some of the detail here, if I may, Dr. Mundy, is that since 1994, DFIs, development finance institutions, and their mandates have been repurposed as part of the government's developmental agenda, expanded, in fact, based on 3 principles. The first is additionality, where DFIs only active, DFIs are only active in sectors and activity that are difficult for the private sector and private sector capital sources to address. So that is the additionality principle. The second is that they are catalysts for accelerated industrialization, job creation, economic growth, and human capital development. And the third is that they serve as anchors of sustainability for bridging critical investment gaps. Now, unlike the SOE complex, where there are, according to the estimates of the PRC report and the NPC report, 715 in one case, 800 in the other, there are only 16 DFIs equally split between national and provincial government. The important thing to note here with regard to the expanded mandates of development finance institutions is observations. First is that these expanded mandates have translated very poorly in terms of their costs and benefits to society and the economy, especially as diversifying productive activity is concerned. Right? That's the first. Second is that there have been worrisome trends in the financial performance of development finance institutions as a distinct class of entities. That means and translates into the observation that their financial performance has been characterized by mounting losses, poor loan recovery, and continued dependence on the state to underwrite their operational costs, despite disbursing something like 275 billion rands annually. So in short, the observation, the conclusion can be drawn from these observations is that the self-sustainability of development finance institutions has been the Achilles heel and has been a major source of their institutional and financial vulnerability. The paper then goes into providing a sample of DFI profiles, the mandates and the scope of their operations. There are about 9 of those which are summarized. I won't go into those, but it includes the Industrial Development Corporation, the DBSA, Development Bank of Southern Africa, the Land and Agricultural Development Bank of South Africa, Kula Enterprises, etc., etc. So those are summarized, as part of trying to show various and very diversified dimensions of DFI activity in South Africa's political economy. Let me then now jump to the comparative experiences, having tried to give snapshots into what SOEs and DFIs look like, and in terms of those short summary profiles. The paper goes into 2 sets of dimensions on what we can learn from the comparative experience, primarily informed by the influence of globalization, and the impact of competitive liberalization, which has really highlighted the importance of governments, not only in emerging markets such as South Africa, but essentially to deal with the pressures of globalization, resorting to state-owned enterprises and development finance institutions serve as catalysts of growth, development, job creation, and indeed as platforms for economic growth and social development. The DFI dimension then refers to the comparative experiences of Egypt, Finland, France, Hungary, Russia, and Singapore. The DFI dimensions look at Brazil, Mexico, India, and South Korea. Now, in the interest of time, let me just emphasize the experience of China here, because I think it's quite interesting to refer to China in terms of the very gradualist reform agenda underpinning state-owned enterprises and development finance institutions over the last 25 years, starting indeed with the reform agenda of Deng Xiaoping in 1978. What is interesting here is that in 2003, that is 25 years, after beginning the reform process of SOEs and DFAs, the shift from sort of Maoist egalitarianism, where SOEs, as a matter of fact, across China's political economy, generated something like 80% of industrial output. So the normative and policy endeavor was really to move SOEs to become more or less, critical strategic centers of gravity, or to provide the gravitational pull to a market-oriented growth and development agenda, or what in China is called socialism with Chinese characteristics. In 2003, so 25 years after the process started, in 2003, the government of China then put in place what it called the State-Owned Asset Supervision Administration Commission, mouthful, SASAC, of the State Council, right? So SASAC oversees rationalization and the consolidation of the SOE complex. Accompanying SASAC is a limited liability company called Central Huijin, which was formed to really govern the reform of development finance institutions. The critical point here is both SASAC, the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, and Central Huijin have overseen the reduction of the relative economic weight of the state sector in the Chinese economy by opening more industrial sectors to competition from non-state enterprises based on the approach, and I like this, grasping the big, letting go of the small. So it's very important to note, that the central government controls a complex of SOEs that provide a kind of hierarchical point of reference for how the rest of SOEs and DFIs across 22 provinces, autonomous regions, municipalities, village councils, etc., have to function. So it's a reduction, in essence, of the 80% of industrial output of SOEs, what we currently have. I don't have the percentage, but I would imagine it's probably between 15 to 20%. As a result of this, let me underscore this, the number of SOEs and DFIs owned by the central government in China have declined from 196 in 2003 to 115 in 2013, 96 currently. And SOEs and DFIs that fall under the State Asset Supervision and Administration Commission, as well as Central Wujian, found in strategic industries only and sectors that play vitally important roles in national security, or they are catalysts for growth and development. And here the government exercises absolute control over these sectors through a sole ownership regime or a controlling state. And those sectors include defense, petroleum and petrochemicals, electricity generation, transmission and distribution, telecommunication, shipping, and civil aviation. There is then an ancillary group in China that are designated as pillars and basic industries. And these include sectors such as machinery, automobile, steel, chemicals and metals, and R&D. And that R&D component is pretty important in terms of this consolidated, CESAC and Central Region ownership complex, in the sense that they were largely responsible for developing Sinovac and Sinopharm, the vaccines combat deal with the pandemic. Come now, how much time do I have, Dr. Mundy?
For a minute, thank you.
Are you serious?
Yep.
Oh my goodness, I haven't even dealt with the PPP framework, right? Huh. Well, let me skip, can you give me like 3 minutes?
With pleasure.
I just want to make the point, the important point on the principles governing public-private partnerships, because these are important, given that South Africa is one of the 5 OECD partners, along with Brazil, China, India, and Indonesia, and it also has an associate status where these principles and guidelines are very important, in terms of how it shapes policies in South Africa. The importance of this PPP framework is that it can guide how South Africa can structure public-private partnerships between SOEs, DFIs, and the private sector in terms of these 3 principles: clear, predictable, legitimate institutional framework supported by competent and well-resourced authorities. The second is value for money must inform the selection of the PPP. And then the third is that fiscal risks must be minimized, and the integrity of the procurement process must be ensured through transparent budgetary processes. Now, I wish I had a little more time to develop that, because it is so important. It is a very important underpinning, but maybe the discussions can pick that up, as a third dimension of the paper. So let me just come quickly to the kind of recommendations that are made here. The paper then makes recommendations across 2 clusters. The first is that the Presidential State-Owned Enterprise Council, since it is chaired by President Ramaphosa, should appoint 2 task teams. The first is really to study the recommendations of the Piega report, 31 of those, And there are 21 principles that are very important. No need to reinvent the wheel here. This could form a strategic underpinning for presenting and developing modalities to the Presidential State-Owned Enterprise Council for a single and overarching legal framework. The second is also the appointment of a task team 2, I call it, propose terms of reference for setting up of a public-private partnership unit in the presidency, sort of govern this three-way partnership, drawing on the OECD guidelines that I just, rather summarily referred to. And then quite crucially, in terms of that recommendation, is to institute a process of consultation among NEDLAC social partners to ensure that there is broad-based participation and support for the work of this PPP unit. So my final word then, Dr. Mundy, and here I might commit a bit of a heresy by referring to Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was widely considered, the sort of the archdeacon of monetary fundamentalism. But I think he makes an important point in this observation that I'm about to cite from what he said to his fellow monetarists. And he says, the point basically make here is that South Africa should not waste a crisis, or as the Confucian saying goes, there is opportunity in adversity. And this is what Friedman says to his fellow monetarists. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And I underscore the ideas that are lying around. You just have to examine and read very carefully the report of the PRC committee, the 5 papers of the NPC, those ideas that are lying around. Then Friedman goes on, that I believe is our basic function. Develop alternatives to existing policies to keep them alive and available until, to underscore again, until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lepierre, for an amazing presentation. Without wasting too much time, I want to turn over to Dr. Michelle Richards. Please take over, Doc.
Thank you, Dr. Mundy. Can I just clarify that I'm no longer with the DBSA? I left in February this year. So I am a free academic in my opinion right now. Thank you, Dr. Lepierre, for a very interesting paper. I hope it gets legs and goes into the DFIs. My focus on my comments will be on DFIs because that's the area that I'm more familiar with rather than the SOEs. So I'm hoping Dr. Mfeka will cover the SOEs sufficiently for my lack of focus on that. I'm putting on an alarm so that I can speak in 10 minutes. Out of the 16 DFIs that are in South Africa, I think we have 3 or now 2.5, because the DBSA and the IDC are the only 2 functioning ones with the land bank on crutches. So we don't actually have that many institutions who can do the work that is necessary. The others are provincial or local government level development institutions that would require a lot of financing, a lot of institutional reform, and a lot of skills at that level to make sure that the development agenda is met with across the 3 tiers of government. What Dr. Lepierre is talking about in the successful models are mostly policy banks, banks that have been set up by governments as a single institution that drives government policy. And this we see examples of across the BRICS banks, for example, Vneshekonom Bank in Russia, Bindes, CDB, and India, Exim is the Indian representative, but it deals with, it's more of an IDC kind of model. So we're looking at institutions that have a particular role to play, but are fully financed by government. And so our South African DFIs are not financed by government to the extent that these international ones are. What we also have is a mandate that is dispersed between the banks that makes for a really difficult collaboration. Because, for example, the IDC reports to the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. DBSA reports to the National Treasury, as does the Land Bank. We also have these mandates where we are told that the banks cannot finance to prevent mandate creep, because then you'd find that some clients might double dip, or we might be taking business away from one DFI to the other one that doesn't have that clear mandate. So one of Dr. Lepierre's assumptions is that DFIs can garner concessional finance. The problem with concessional finance in South Africa is that we are currently not an LIC, a low income country. And so our middle income status, however compromised that might be, or however controversial that might be, we do not have the rating, or not the rating, the positionality that gives us access to concessional finance. We might get grants for ring-fenced programs, as the Americans have given to us for Power Africa, a number of health programs that we've received as well. But also concessional finance would then be linked to the PPP, with a third country coming in where South Africa could possibly manage that concessional finance. But PPP, not in the sense that Dr. Lepierre has used it, mainly triangular cooperation across different DFIs with a client in the middle. So the one thing is that we don't have enough finance. We also don't have the agility of the finance institutions that we are working with. South Africa's financial or DFIs are extremely cumbersome. They are highly bureaucratic. They are extremely focused on process. And so what we find is that the programs that have worked really well, like the Green Fund, like the Jobs Fund, have been moved out of the DFIs and into government ministries in order for them to be ring-fenced and run from government ministries by highly skilled teams. So what does it say about our institutions, actually? We have institutions that are not agile. They cannot respond to the crisis that Dr. Lepierre mentioned at the end of his paper. And so I would argue that instead of repositioning the DFIs, we might need to repurpose the DFIs, because we have to look at processes and structures in order to meet the development agenda of South Africa. We are not making decisions fast enough. So yes, the PPP framework brings the private sector in, and we see phenomenal interest in the President's Infrastructure Fund, Rolf Meyer's collaboration with the presidency on the public-private growth initiative. So there is phenomenal interest, but the private sector is frustrated with government moving so slowly. The fact that there are so many task teams, Dr. Lepierre, that decisions are not made fast enough in order to take advantage of those crises that come up. And also the strategic sectors. I mean, I remember at one stage that we were discussing what are the economic driving sectors, and these don't seem to be taking root, or it's a very slow development. The motor industry has done very well in South Africa, with Toyota deciding to stay. And unfortunately, Johan van Zyl has passed recently. So it would be interesting to see who takes the lead on the Africa-Europe program there. But we're also looking at transport infrastructure, water and sanitation. These are projects, especially water and sanitation, that require a lot of finance because they are public good. The private sector hasn't gone into that much, into water and sanitation that much. So there are these points where the DFIs need private sector involvement, but they're not getting it because of the attractiveness or the high risk characteristics of the projects, that they don't give that much of a financial return, even though the development impact of those sectors are extremely high once they start going. So I'm going to end with 2 points. PPPs are not a panacea to all problems. We're also dealing with institutions that are struggling to do the work that they currently do. For PPPs to exist, they need strong institutions, strong legislative frameworks, very clear policy directives. And I think we've seen in South Africa that policy is there, but the implementation and the actual delivery on the policy is really, really poor and hasn't had that much of an impact. DFIs have not traditionally been flexible, and this is my last point. They're huge ships that take time to change, but they have sections of innovation that have done really well. Unfortunately, the institutions as a whole have not been innovative, but there have been areas like in the renewable energy that has taken up the challenge to do the 100 megawatt projects, innovation and tech financing that is doing a lot of tech-based financing for new companies. Women and youth lens financing opportunities are also coming up, but they need to be scaled. DFIs fall back into traditional roles and financing modalities that don't actually serve us right now. We need to think of ways to finance small businesses that look differently at what collateral means, how loans are paid back, the nature of the projects that we finance, and who leads those projects. For this to happen, DFIs in South Africa need to be agile, they need to be adaptable and transformative in their agendas, which they currently are not because they are hamstrung by restrictive policy frameworks. So I'll stop there, Dr. Lapierre. Thank you very much for an interesting paper that I will definitely share across my networks. And I look forward to Dr. Mfeka's conversation as well. Thank you, Dr. Mundy.
Thank you so much to the researchers. Dr. Mfeka, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mundy, Dr. Ritas, and Dr. Lapierre. Well, it's a very pertinent subject, the transformation of state-owned enterprises and DFIs. And the paper raises very important recommendations that, as Dr. Ruta says, they hinge on implementation. And the fact that we already have the Presidential SOE Council, it's very important because it's chaired by the President and it provides the gravitas for implementation. However, we need to look back at what causes the delays in implementation, because as Dr. Lapierre says, there were different reviews, studies by departments, as well as the national private sector. I saw very interesting private sector-led initiative that reviewed SOEs, which is very interesting. The implementation from my side, which comes from my observations as having participated in the PRC, as well as my experience in the presidency, where you observe action from different ministries. As we said, there's a complex governance structure, which is very fragmented in terms of location, where these SOEs are, in terms of oversight, different departments, different municipalities, as Dr. Lapierre highlighted. So my experience with implementation is precisely because of the nature of SOEs themselves, which are heavily politicized, by their nature. Because remember, even their formation in the context of the political economy at different points in time. As you'll observe, most of these SOEs were formed under apartheid. They serve the purpose, which tells you that as things evolve, some of them may have their purposes diluted and not fit for current purpose. So the leadership, political leadership, plays a critical role, of which I hope there will be more studies that look at that dynamic. Especially if you consider the fact that the governing party is a broad church, which means dealing with SOEs, people are pulling from different strands, ideological strands, from the same party. You will find those who are inclined towards the left of the political spectrum and those who are inclined towards the right of the political spectrum. So that's the complexity now when you deal with SOEs. In our review, we looked at the continuum of ideological spectrum from Western economies to Eastern economies. And we were inspired by all different strands and the approaches that have been made, as Dr. Lipia has referred to the OECD, for instance, because you have lots of learning experiences from different parts of the world. Now, when you look at the ANC itself, you will find that the challenge is always on how this manifests in government, how these different strands manifest in government, and the contentions around decisiveness on taking policy action. Those manifest in ESCOM of this world, your SAA, and also you find it takes time to implement decisions because of the. So for instance, for me, because we don't have time, I'll just highlight that as something to think about, the political leadership. And when it comes to other factors that are important for implementation, we should be able to look at the context, the economic market context. It's very important because SOEs exist for a particular purpose at a certain period of our existence. In this case, the South African economy is quite complex because it has a very strong private sector, which is monopolistic and oligopolistic. And that private sector is competing very well in the market. And the state needs to box cleverly because the intention of the state is not to crowd out the private sector. It is to be strategic and deal with specific areas of development where there are development failures. So in carving the way out, those issues, understanding of market is very important. Where are we? And understanding of development as well. For instance, the contestations at ESCOM revolve around the demands for open markets in terms of energy, and also the demand for electricity to bridge the inequalities and address the issues of access to electricity at a good price for people. So those are complexities that we need to look at. There are also legal issues when it comes to implementation. For instance, the complexity around our laws governing these SOEs, as well as the issues around the covenants that's where SOEs have to deal with the evolution and the move towards a new framework or configuration. Typical case studies is the ESCOM as well. How do you move it without creating chaos in the markets? Finally, the key issue, which is critical as well, is the issue of capacity to implement. the government, as we all know, is very thin on capacity that is appropriate to drive these huge entities. ESCOM is a couple of African countries' GDP. To say you are restructuring such an entity requires serious skills and capacity that must be there. Hence, there's always this inclination that private sector can assist. But of course, there are challenges, as Dr. Michelle has highlighted. So for me, those are critical issues which will bring to fruition these recommendations suggested by Dr. Lepierre. And of course, leadership is at the top of what needs to be done. It must be strong and be clear in its resolve and ideological understanding of where we're taking this based on evidence that this fiscal of governance can assist actually to provide that evidence towards implementation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tamfega. Dr. Lepierre, do you want to respond before I open up for questions?
You asked me whether I'd like to respond, Dr. Mundy.
Yes, to your respondents before I open up for questions.
Yeah, look, you know, my connection was a little unstable, so I lost a little bit about what Dr. Reiters was saying. I sort of got the gist of it. I would, you know, just as a matter of you know, conceptual interest and policy relevance, underscore a point that I couldn't make with regard to public-private partnerships. And I think, you know, there is an argument that could be made for the salutary and you know, economic impacts of PPPs if properly structured. Now, I refer in the paper, by the way, to a World Bank reference guide, which deals with the focal areas of public-private partnerships with the best returns. And the best returns for PPPs are especially in the strategic areas where South Africa suffers, energy and power generation, you know, proper and prudential, provincial and municipal management, telecommunications and ICT, transportation and water and sanitation, right? That's on the one hand. Those focal areas, the reference guide argues, deliver better welfare gains if they promote or include PPPs with a developmental purpose. And I think, yeah, you know, what both Dr. Mfeka and Dr. Reiters said is a re-engineering, or what Dr. Reiters referred to as a repurposing. And I think if you can sort of, you know, reorient the ideological and the discursive arguments towards this developmental purposes. The reference guide for the World Bank says that PPPs with the developmental purposes really can promote greater welfare gains in areas such as green and climate smart interventions, working for the poor and alleviating poverty, quite critical in a country such as ours, developing human resources and transferring skills, enhancing participation and job creation by SMEs. I think that's another point underscored by Dr. Reiters, promoting gender equity and including women, and then providing funding for risk mitigation. I think that goes directly and indirectly to a point that Dr. Mfeka made about, you know, how do you sort of be in the private sector, you know, to think quite strategically in risk mitigation. And as we know, Dr. Mundy, in South Africa, you know, there is what is called lazy capital lying around, something, I know the figure varies, but it's about 1 trillion rands that is just lying around waiting to be used for purposes such as these, provided, you know, that the government can create a kind of policy certainty and a kind of environment in which inspires greater trust and confidence. And then finally is, you know, the importance of having workable mechanisms. We have the policies, but workable mechanisms for promoting transparency, governance, and then anti-corruption. I would also like to refer to the importance really of having this single legal framework, because this is the experience one gets from looking at sort of the comparisons with other countries, which the bigger report contains. And the problem that we have in South Africa is that you have different founding legislations, characterized by duplication, conflicting provisions, etc. So it seems to me, that an argument can be made for the PSEC, the Presidential State-Owned Enterprise Council, to really concentrate its mind into looking at, having a consolidated framework for both SOEs and DFAs that relate to these critical areas of corporate governance, relevant systems of management, structures, processes, procedures, etc., and bringing all these together within a single legal and policy framework. So that is a short rejoinder, Mundy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So colleagues, please feel free to put in some questions on Q&A, both on Facebook as well as Zoom. I've got some comments coming from the chat from Murure Mpahlele. He says, thank you very much for discussions on this important component of development in our country. The absence of a long-term plan of SOEs is echoed, in my view. The absence of such a plan for the country itself. South Africa may benefit from a long-term plan of, say, 50 to 100 years, and such a plan should be broken down into intervals of between 5 and 10 years. This plan should define an agenda for the country and should not be altered, irrespective of the change in political leadership. And then I've got some questions that have come through. Sigribo Mfuya is asking, what makes these DFIs to operate like commercial banks? So if Dr. Pierre or Dr. Reuters want to respond to Strabo, I'll appreciate. Strabo goes on to make a comment that they tend to benefit only a few black elite from their support packages. Dr. Pierre, if you note that question. And then I've got another one. Then
can I defer that question to Dr. Reuters because she has the experience of DBSA? Mm-hmm. I have opinions which relate directly, to the extent to which, DFIs and certain SOEs, and this also comes through in the NPC papers, have been subject to state capture and manipulation and abuse of resources, corruption, etc., etc. But maybe it could sort of add our own viewpoints to that.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Mundy. It's an accusation that was often directed at the DBSA, saying that their money is too expensive. There are two aspects here. Government does not finance the DBSA to the extent that other governments finance their DFIs, which is fully financed, which means that the grant window that could bring down the cost of finance within projects is very small. The other issue is that the DBSA gets its money from international capital markets. And when the state's credit rating goes down, the DBSA and IDC and all the other state institutions, their credit ratings go down, which makes it more expensive to borrow money from the international institutions. So, and then the DFI model is very different from commercial banks. So we look at relationship building over a 10 to 25-year period. And that is written in with project preparation, with relationship building, making sure that the project happens along the way. It's a long-term relationship, which commercial banks do not do. So I understand the concern raised. There are different aspects that we need to look at when we answer that question. And I think the concern is genuine and real, that the money is expensive, but the argument is that they're bringing a lot more than commercial banks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richards. Skungo Jeben comments on the chart that it will be good if African states will follow the models of North-North countries by separating political administration terms than to link development terms on political administration terms. That is what impacts negatively growth and development terms in African continent. One of the major challenges facing our continent is short-termism planning. So those are some of the challenges we need to focus on to redirect our SOEs. I have a question from anonymous attendee. The question reads, can the board of directors of our SOEs plead with the government to disassociate plans of development for these institutions from political administration terms? Anyone? Dr. Lippier and then Dr. Mfega.
Dr. Mundy, frankly, I didn't understand that question. Can you please summarize it?
The question is, can the board of directors of SOEs plead to the government to disassociate plans of development for these institutions from political administration terms? In simpler terms, basically, can we have a long-term view?
I would say with great difficulty, because of the the issues that Dr. Mfeka has raised, which go to the heart of political interference in the way both DFAs, SOEs are run, how the boards are appointed, how the senior management is appointed, etc. Unless these are separated out into independent and autonomous entities that are driven by particular mandates, shareholder compacts, where there is no confusion in terms of the vertical accountability. The problem of political interference in the appointment of boards and the appointment of senior management, I think will continue to complicate any reform agenda that the PSEC is going to try to put in place. It really requires bold, serious, bold strategic leadership. And that's why I always find the example of China to be so interesting, because, a political calculus there really determined the reform agenda. And this was really, to what extent SOEs and DFIs over this very long period of reform. And we are talking in the case of China, even in the other comparative examples that form the basis of the comparative study within the PRC study, that there is a very long lead time of political reform that is required to turn the juggernaut of SOEs and DFIs around in a country like China. And I would say, all things being equal, the same applies to South Africa. Why does a country with a GDP of, say, $350 billion and a population of less than 60, require such a large spread of, especially SOEs, spread across national, provincial, and local government? And these entities not then lend themselves to a broad development. They must have a social purpose. I think this is where the government, might want to sort of learn from this comparative experience. And it's really to put in place a kind of very concerted ideology, I would say, sort of drawing from a kind of neo-Keynesian, kind of thinking that turns SOEs and DFAs into aggressive and assertive supply-side agents. They really have to correct some of the, the serious anomalies in the way the economy is managed, particularly with regard to its monopolistic and oligopolistic character. And again, I think the dynamics of a kind of PPP kind of agenda can help to sort of drive that sort of neo-Keynesian agenda? Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Lepierre. Dr. Mfega?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think I can add that commercial SOEs needs to be, to have a different type of an oversight, which is detached from politics. It's very true, because they operate for commercial purposes. If they have to have a developmental mandate, then that should be considered very carefully, because that may interfere with their commercial operations or practices. And they also need to have very similar governance and ethical framework as that of private companies. That's why the Companies Act incorporated state-owned SOEs as state-owned companies, those that are commercial. But in government, you find them reporting to a political head with technocrats, government bureaucrats overseeing that commercial operation, which brings lots of frustration. Also, to operate within the legislative framework that is meant for government is different from operating commercially. So in many countries, they've separated the oversight of commercial companies from politics and governments. So it's a very valid question.
Thanks, Ramfega. Sakile Nkonyane makes a comment on the chart. I fully agree with the paper from Dr. Lepierre. I believe all these SOEs suffer from the same syndrome of not knowing their mandate and a lot of government interferences. My belief is that what needs to go first is the systems that govern the entities, because without such, no matter how much cash you inject, nothing will materialize. And that's the view from Sakile Nkonyane. Lerato, are there any questions from Facebook?
No, not yet, Doc.
No, thank you so much. There's a further comment coming from Khapane Sibidi, who says there are state organs like the Northwest Development Corporation, the former Bophuthatswana National Development Corporation, which built factories and created jobs in areas like Tabanchu, Mabato, Itsoseng, Harankua, Babelechi, Amanskral, etc. Today, they stand empty and are being vandalized. These structures were built with taxpayers' money. The organization had shares in Sun International and developing shopping centers in township and rural areas. Politics in this country preaches a gospel which it fails to live by. And leaders are not being held to account for the decisions they make on economic development. There is a further question, my speakers, anyone can take this question. It's again from anonymous attendee. He or she asks, or in our agenda for that matter, is it not true that the problems revolve around two issues? The first, lack of leadership and resolve to transform the economy so that it becomes inclusive. And secondly, corruption of unprecedented proportions. Anyone can take it. Maybe let me start with Dr. Reuters, and then I'll go to Mfega, and then Dr. Lepierre. Dr. Richards, any view about these two questions around leadership and lack of resolve to transform, and the corruption?
I think it points to the issues that Dr. Mfeka has raised around the political nature of the development finance institutions. Sorry, I haven't put my camera on. That they are politically steeped in party politics. And so it depends on who's running the country at that time. He referred to the apartheid era when they were set up, and they were run for apartheid reasons then. And so I think it's important that, you know, we're not going to get the resolve. We're not going to get leadership that is going to change, and unless we have people at the helm who are fearless and brave and willing to take on the party and government. At the risk of sounding partial, Andre de Ruyter is an example of that, who has taken on a lot, and I'm sure there are many other SOE members, heads who have also taken on government, and possibly at their own expense. Corruption. I think the tender process and the PFMA process, even though it tried to set up or correct a historical wrong, it has actually created a lot of controversial practice within the SOEs and within the DFIs that talk to those elite who can benefit from the tender process. We need to move away from that, because the tender process has also resulted in a lack of quality in the outputs, as the price has often trumped the quality. So there are a lot of things that we need to look at within DFIs. Lack of leadership is a huge one. And then the corruption is another one that we have to deal with in the future. Sorry, I don't have exact answers on that, Dr. Mundy.
Thank you so much, Doritos. Dr. Mflaga?
Yes, I think the anonymous attendee is correct to say it probably resolves around those two areas. Of course, if you dive deep in each, you find that there are complexities that must be tackled. For instance, if you talk about leadership, there is contestation. As I said, the governing party is a broad church, and also the opposition is also as complex. It means then you have uncertainty and the different centers of power that happen and play out in government. Similarly, with corruption, there are different types of corruption. There's old corruption in SOEs. Yesterday, I was talking on radio about the evergreen contracts, which seems to be always hidden under the carpet, with the mainstream narrative focusing on the new forms of corruption, whereas these entities have history and they are contested even around the corruption itself. So to come out of this, we would need to really have a strong, decisive leadership, as Dr. Reuters has indicated. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Reuters, can you respond to these two questions and then make a sorry, not Dr. Reuters, Dr. Pierre.
Can you actually given me
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to pick up on what Dr. Mfeka said around leadership. And I might be assuming, might be making the wrong assumption here, that he speaks about leadership as party leadership. I'm talking about leadership as the leader of the one person who is at the helm, who has to make those difficult decisions. Yes, they're influenced by party leadership or by government policymakers. But you need that one person who's going to stand up and take accountability and step down when things fall apart. So, you know, I'm not sure we have that in the public sector to the extent that we need it. We have those single people who stand up. But generally, that's where we need to build. We need to build municipal managers, all the levels of government. We need that excellence.
I'll hand over to Dr. Pierre, if you can respond to those two questions, and also make a final comment before I hand over to Professor Kobo to close our proceeding this afternoon.
Dr. Mundy, I think, you know, I've sort of said my say, and Anonymous is essentially preaching to the converted here, I think. I don't have anything more to add, you know, other than to say that both Reuters and in fact, you know, on the mark. You know, the problem of leadership and the leadership deficits are so deeply embedded in the way DFIs and SOEs are run, particularly SOEs, you know, over the last 25 years. And, you know, the tragedy of the commons in South Africa is that, you know, these entities have driven the government's developmental state agenda in ways that have delivered the kind of broad-based welfare gains that have made, I think, deep inroads into the structural problems of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. You know, quite the opposite has happened. They are now part of a very sort of toxic ecosystem in governance. And it would take a very, very strong and committed leadership at the political level to change these. And I think this, again, points to the point that Dr. Reiters is making. And I would go so far as to say that until you have a kind of meritocratic system in how senior managers are appointed to these entities, and you try and move away, and this will be very difficult in terms of the points that Dr. Mfeka is making with regard to, you know, how these entities serve particular political purposes. And it still, you know, really confounds me why, you know, SOEs, you know, cannot be streamlined and rationalized to serve the developmental purposes. Why are SOEs, for example, Qualified Labor Bureau, employing something like 150,000 people in a highly unionized environment, and you dare not touch them, you know, for fear of creating sort of major structural disruption. So it seems to me, you know, that as I tried to emphasize and underscore in the paper, there is no need to invent the wheel, but you need a political impulse to come from somewhere. And that political impulse, the seed, I think, has been sown in the Presidential SOE Council. The challenge is, can President Ramaphosa drive a deep-seated reform agenda of the kind that we have seen in the case of China?
Thank you so much, Dr. Pierre, and thank you so much to my respondents, Dr. Michelle Richards and Dr. Begum Feka. And thank you to all of you for attending this afternoon's discussion around our SOEs and the development finance institutions. I want now to hand over to Professor Mzusi Qobo to make some closing remarks. It's been fantastic for me to facilitate this discussion. Thank you so much and good afternoon.
Can I say something quickly, Dr. Mundy?
Yes, please.
You are also an expert on SOEs. We never got the benefit of your insights. You say something like in 30 seconds, quickly. You wrote the whole PhD on ESCOM, didn't you?
I did, but the platform was yours, and Dr. Richards as well as Dr. Mfeka. Mine was to get us engaged, so I've done my job.
Oh, but just give us 30 seconds of your wisdom, Dr. Mundy. What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, my thought process really is very similar to some of the comments that have been made. That is basically the lack of capability of knowledge and understanding how the economy functions at the political helm, and the undermining of highly skilled Black professional is a dangerous cocktail that leads to the crisis of these SOEs. Until SOEs are given the legislative framework that you've referred to, and the leadership is appointed on merit, not because of the political deployment committee of the governing parties, the South African SOEs will remain in crisis and will underperform and will continue trying to fix them, something that we've been doing since 1994. That's my comment. Professor Mzusi here, I want you to thank our guests as well as all our attendees, both on Facebook as well as on Zoom. Thank you so much.
you. Thank you so much.
Lerato, is someone thanking or should I do the thanking? Lerato?
Doc, please.
So, colleagues, just again, Dr. Richards, thank you so much for a fantastic paper that has stimulated the discussion that we've had today. Dr. Lipia, Dr. Richards, thanks for your amazing respondents, as well as Dr. Mfega. Thank you so much. Colleagues from the School of Governance and across the VIS community and others who came from SOEs attended today, thank you so much. We hope that you will again, when we invite you to these intellectual discussions, you'll answer the call and engage as we try to make a difference in South Africa, to get South Africa working and functioning so that we can be able to create an environment of opportunity and a better life for all. So with those words, thank you so much for attending today's functions, and please stay safe and make sure that you wear the mask, social distance, and good afternoon. Thank you.